I really had blocked out like my whole childhood. And I I knew that I felt uncomfortable around my dad. I knew there was something not right. A lot of it was very covert abuse,
Uh-huh.
very covered up a lot of inappropriateness
Uh-huh.
that I didn't realize was inappropriate and abusive until I got into a 12-step program, Overeaters Anonymous, and heard other people sharing their story and realized that, oh, that wasn't normal. And what I felt and what I saw, and was uncomfortable with, was inappropriate.
Can you give an example?
Having Playboy magazines around, that were exposed to us kids, making inappropriate comments about other women's bodies in front of me, even in front of my mom, making inappropriate sexual jokes in front of me or family friends, taking pictures of me when I would go out swimming to our pool in our backyard. My mom just accepted those things. She lived in denial. She didn't even really make excuses for some of these inappropriate things. And like I said, I just thought that that was normal. I had never even really wasn't familiar with covert abuse. I thought, I was thinking that, it had to be something, very overt and very obvious. I got into OA. Was recovering from an eating disorder. I was a compulsive overeater, anorexic, and bulimic. There's a lot of other incest survivors who have eating disorders, a lot of incest survivors in OA. I was working with a sponsor at the time. She was also a survivor, thank God. I did have a flashback of my dad wanting me to give him oral sex. It was the week before Thanksgiving. Like I said, I was 28 years old, so it was like 1991. My son, I was newly married. I had a new son. He was 11 months old. He was going to turn a year old on December 30th. And it was the week before Thanksgiving. And I remember I was living in Tucson with my husband and my son, and my family all lived there also. My dad's family was all from Tucson. And I was still very close with my parents then at the time, especially my mom. I was very enmeshed with my mom and depended on her a lot emotionally. And we talked a lot, and saw a lot of each other and talked on the phone several times a week. And I remember saying to myself, when I talked to her, the next time I talked to her and she asked me how I'm doing, I'm going to really tell her this time instead of just saying I'm fine. And she called, or I called her. She asked me how I was doing. And I told her that I had gotten this flashback of sexual abuse from my dad. And I remember there was like a pregnant pause, and I could hear her kind of welling up, you know, getting kind of teary. And the next thing I remember her saying was, well, I need to talk to your father about this. 48, 72 hours later, we were talking again on the phone, and she said, I talked to your father, and he doesn't admit to anything, and I believe him. And I said, well, then I guess that's the end of our relationship. I was a newlywed, a new mom, living in a new city. I had moved from upstate New York to be near my family in Tucson. My family, my biological family, one of my brothers was living in Tucson, and still does. My grandparents, my dad's parents were still alive then. They were in Tucson. My whole family, my aunt, I have a couple aunts, several relatives. That's where my dad's family pretty much settled. And I disclosed to most of them, and everybody's loyalty was to my dad. And it was extremely painful, as you can imagine. I remember my grandfather, my dad's dad, I remember telling him and what I remember his response being was, I know my son has problems, but you keep your mouth shut or you're not part of this family. A few things happened. One, I found out that my parents found the one, I don't know if he was a psychiatrist or psychologist in Phoenix that believed in false memory syndrome and was touting false memory syndrome then. And of course, so they were holding on to that. They also blamed, as stereotypically happens, I was in therapy at the time. Of course,
Right.
they thought my therapist had planted it in my head. And part of my story, I always say, I understand why, my mom and my husband, they had to live in denial. I mean, I say it turned my world upside down. It would have crushed her little glass house. I mean, she was living a very good life in Tucson with my dad and his family and being in the family business now. My dad's family is a very prominent family in Tucson. My grandfather built the first shopping mall there and bought up lots of commercial real estate and is very well known there. They've been there since like the 1940s, 50s. And so this was a big deal. And if it got out, and it did, the interesting thing is though, I didn't grow up in Tucson. My dad and my parents moved out there when my grandfather was getting elderly, and he wanted my dad to go into the family business, into the real estate business with my uncle, his brother. My dad was a rabbi, and I grew up in very small rural towns and in very small Jewish communities, and he was the rabbi of very small congregations. My family was very philanthropic, and my mom and dad gave a lot of money to the U of A theater department. And it's always, in the name of Rabbi and Mrs. I lost my whole family, and I had to grieve that and do a lot of grieving. And I say it was the best thing that happened to me, and the worst thing that happened to me was getting those memories. Because I know that I would not be the person today I am today. I would not be the mom that I am today. I have two amazing kids. They're very close with each other. We don't keep secrets. And that was a cycle that I really wanted to break. And I've always said that my mission in life is to change the legacy of my family, because this has been going, I know this did not start with my dad, that it's been going on for generations and generations. And that's why I am so committed to my recovery, and hope to pass that on. And that, with each generation, hopefully things, our family tree will get a little healthier. I have a middle brother who, after many years, he came around and he affirmed the abuse. And he has been my only ally in the family.
But he took a long time before he came
He
forward.
did. And I think that again, the acceptance, he was working, he had moved to Tucson, also from New York, and was working for my parents and my family in the family business. So again, I understand, the loyalty, and, money is a big hook in my family. It's a blessing and a curse. And we've talked about it. I understand and I accept, I understand why he needed to do that, and I accept it. And I think, he was going through his own demons and issues. I didn't think I would ever step into a synagogue ever again. And it just so happened, because I wanted to raise my kids Jewish, again, divine intervention. The rabbi here at the time was a female rabbi. And that made all the difference. And to this day, I'm best friends with her. And she's a survivor. It does happen in Jewish families. It does happen in the Jewish community. There are addictions. There is sexual abuse. It happens with clergymen, just like in, pastors in other religions.
Yeah.
Um, and it's protected and kept a secret. And I will always share my story for whoever wants to hear it.